Labor economics seeks to understand the functioning and dynamics of the markets for wage labor. Labor markets or job markets function through the interaction of workers and employers. Labor economics looks at the suppliers of labor services, the demands of labor services, and attempts to understand the resulting pattern of wages, employment, and income. In economics, labor is a measure of the work done by human beings. It is conventionally contrasted with such other factors of production as land and capital. There are theories which have developed a concept called human capital. Macro and micro analysis of labor markets. There are two sides to labor economics. Labor economics can generally be seen as the application of macroeconomic techniques to the labor market. Microeconomic techniques study the role of individuals and individual firms in the labor market. Macroeconomic techniques look at the interrelations between the labor market, the goods market, the money market, and the foreign trade market. It looks at how these interactions influence macro variables such as employment levels, participation rates, aggregate income, and gross domestic product. The macroeconomics of labor markets. The labor force is defined as the number of people of working age who are either employed or actively looking for work. The participation rate is the number of people in the labor force divided by the size of the adult civilian non-institutional population. The non-labor force includes those who are not looking for work, those who are institutionalized such as in prisons or psychiatric wards, stay-at-home spouses, children, and those serving in the military. The unemployment level is defined as the labor force minus the number of people currently employed. The unemployment rate is defined as the level of unemployment divided by the labor force. The employment rate is defined as the number of people currently employed divided by the adult population. In these statistics, self-employed people are counted as employed. Variables like employment level, unemployment level, labor force, and unfilled vacancies are called stock variables because they measure a quantity at a point in time. They can be contrasted with flow variables which measure a quantity over a duration of time. Changes in the labor force are due to flow variables such as natural population growth, net immigration, new entrants, and retirements from the labor force. Changes in unemployment depend on inflows made up of non-employed people starting to look for jobs and of employed people who lose their jobs and look for new ones, and outflows of people who find new employment and of people who stop looking for employment. When looking at the overall macroeconomy, several types of unemployment have been identified, including frictional unemployment. This reflects the fact that it takes time for people to find and settle into new jobs. If 12 individuals each take 1 month before they start a new job, the aggregate unemployment statistics will record this as a single unemployed worker. Technological advancement often reduces frictional unemployment. For example, internet search engines have reduced the cost and time associated with locating employment. Structural unemployment. This reflects a mismatch between the skills and other attributes of the labor force and those demanded by employers. If 4 workers each take 6 months off to retrain before they start a new job, the aggregate unemployment statistics will record this as 2 unemployed workers. Rapid industry changes of a technical and/or economic nature will usually increase levels of structural unemployment. For example, widespread implementation of new machinery or software will require future employees to be trained in this area before seeking employment. The process of globalization has contributed to structural changes in labor. Some domestic industries such as textile manufacturing have expanded to cope with global demand, whilst other industries such as agricultural products have contracted due to greater competition from international national producer's natural rate of unemployment. This is the summation of frictional and structural unemployment, that excludes cyclical contributions of unemployment, e.g., recessions. It is the lowest rate of unemployment that a stable economy can expect to achieve. Seeing as some frictional and structural unemployment is inevitable, economists do not agree on the natural rate, with estimates ranging from 1% to 5%, or on its meaning. Some associate it with non-accelerating inflation. The estimated rate varies from country to country and from time to time. Demand-deficient unemployment in Keynesian economics. Any level of unemployment beyond the natural rate is most likely due to insufficient demand in the overall economy. During a recession, aggregate expenditure is deficient, causing the underutilization of inputs. Aggregate expenditure can be increased, according to Keynes, by increasing consumption spending, increasing investment spending, increasing government spending, or increasing the net of exports minus imports. AD equals C plus I plus G plus. Monotony. Some labor markets have a single employer and thus do not satisfy the perfect competition assumption of the neoclassical model above. The model of a monosonistic labor market gives a lower quantity of employment and a lower equilibrium wage rate than does the competitive model. Information approaches. In many real-life situations, the assumption of perfect information is unrealistic. An employer does not necessarily know how hard workers are working or how productive they are. This provides an incentive for workers to shirk from providing the full effort, since it is difficult for the employer to identify the hard-working and the shirking employees. There is no incentive to work hard and productivity falls overall, leading to the hiring of more workers and a lower unemployment rate. One solution used recently, stock options, grants employees the chance to benefit directly from a firm's success. However, this solution has attracted criticism as executives with large stock option packages have been suspected of acting to overinflate share values to the detriment of the long-run welfare of the firm. Another solution, foreshadowed by the rise of temporary workers in Japan and the firing of many of these workers in response to the financial crisis of 2008, is more flexible job contracts and terms that encourage employees to work less than full-time by partially compensating for the loss of hours, relying on workers to adapt the working time in response to job requirements and economic conditions instead of the employer trying to determine how much work is needed to complete a given task and overestimating. Another aspect of uncertainty results from the firm's imperfect knowledge about worker ability. If a firm is unsure about a worker's ability, it pays a wage assuming that the worker's ability is the average of similar workers. This wage undercompensates high-ability workers and may drive them away from the labor market. Such a phenomenon, called adverse selection, can sometimes lead to market collapse. There are many ways to overcome adverse selection in labor market. One important mechanism is called signaling, pioneered by Michael Spence. In his classical paper on job signaling, Spence showed that even if formal education does not increase productivity, high-ability workers may still acquire it just to signal their abilities. Employers can then use education as a signal to infer worker ability and pay higher wages to better educated workers. It may appear to an external observer that education has raised the marginal product of labor, without this necessarily being true. Search models. One of the major research achievements of the 1990 to 2010 period was the development of a framework with dynamic search, matching, and bargaining, personnel economics, hiring and incentives. At the micro level, one subdiscipline eliciting increased attention in recent decades is analysis of internal labor markets, that is, within firms, studied in personnel economics from the perspective of personnel management. By contrast, external labor markets imply that workers move somewhat fluidly between firms and wages are determined by some aggregate process where firms do not have significant discretion over wage setting. The focus is on how firms establish, maintain, and end employment relationships and on how firms provide incentives to employees, including models and empirical work on incentive systems, and is constrained by economic efficiency and risk incentive trade-offs relating to personnel compensation. Criticisms. Many sociologists, political economists, and heterodox economists claim that labor economics tends to lose sight of the complexity of individual employment decisions. These decisions, particularly on the supply side, are often loaded with considerable emotional baggage, and a purely numerical analysis can miss important dimensions of the process, such as social benefits of a high income or wage rate regardless of the marginal utility from increased consumption or specific economic goals. For the perspective of mainstream economics, neoclassical models are not meant to serve as a full description of the psychological and subjective factors that go into a given individual's employment relations, but as a useful approximation of human behavior in the aggregate, which can be fleshed out further by the use of concepts such as information asymmetry, transaction costs, contract theory, etc. Also missing from most labor market analyses is the role of unpaid labor, such as unpaid internships, where workers with little or no experience are allowed to work a job without pay so that they can gain experience in a particular profession. Even though this type of labor is unpaid, it can nevertheless play an important part in society if not abused by employers. The most dramatic example is child raising. However, over the past 25 years, an increasing literature, usually designated as the economics of the family, has sought to study within household decision-making, including joint labor supply, fertility, child raising, as well as other areas of what is generally referred to as home production. Wage slavery. The labor market, as institutionalized under today's market economic systems, has been criticized, especially by both mainstream socialists and anarcho-syndicalists, who utilize the term wage slavery as a pejorative for wage labor. Socialists draw parallels between the trade of labor as a commodity and slavery. Cicero is also known to have suggested such parallels. According to Noam Chomsky, analysis of the psychological implications of wage slavery goes back to the Enlightenment era. In his 1791 book On the Limits of State Action, classical liberal thinker Wilhelm von Humboldt explained how whatever does not spring from a man's free choice, or is only the result of instruction and guidance, does not enter into his very nature. He does not perform it with truly human energies, but merely with mechanical exactness, and so when the laborer works under external control, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is. Both the Milgram and Stanford experiments have been found useful in the psychological study of wage-based workplace relations. The American philosopher John Dewey posited that until industrial feudalism is replaced by industrial democracy, politics will be the shadow cast on society by big business. Thomas Ferguson has postulated in his investment theory of party competition that the undemocratic nature of economic institutions under capitalism causes elections to become occasions when blocks of investors coalesce and compete to control the state. As per anthropologist David Graeber, the earliest wage labor contracts we know about were in fact contracts for the rental of chattel slaves. Such arrangements, according to Graeber, were quite common in New World slavery as well, whether in the United States or Brazil. C.L.R. James argued that most of the techniques of human organization employed on factory workers during the Industrial Revolution were first developed on slave plantations. Additionally, Marxists posit that labor as commodity, which is how they regard wage labor, provides an absolutely fundamental point of attack against capitalism. It can be persuasively argued, noted one concerned philosopher, that the conception of the worker's labor as a commodity confirms Marx's stigmatization of the wage system of private capitalism as wage slavery, that is, as an instrument of the capitalists for reducing the worker's condition to that of a slave, if not below it.